Peace and respect to you all. Welcome to Demolished Doctrine, the beginning of the end of religion. Tonight, we're going to have a free flow conversation, nothing really structured, with our friend Maynard Saves. So this is part two, if you remember. We had a talk once a while back.
We did.
Yeah. So part two. So we were over there in Standing for Truth's channel and doing a little bit of standard Christian, traditional critique. So we wanted to come on here and continue with that. Would you tell everybody what your critique was or what your challenge was there, Maynard?
Thanks for having me on, Richard.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate it. Peace and respect, brother. So what it was is I had asked some people that are young earth creationists over in the chat a simple question. All I wanted to know is, historically, according to young earth creationism, when was the wheel invented? When is it recorded? How do you guys lock that down? All I got was bombs and shenanigans, should I say. Nobody wanting an answer, but everybody wanting to know why. Why do you want to know what that is? Well, why don't you answer my question? Let's see where it goes. Nobody wanted to answer anything, Richard. So you ended up popping in there, and I was like, Richard, what do you think? And he's like, it didn't respond. So we thought maybe we'd go live and we'd ask this. And I poked it at Richard. I said, depending on when the wheel was invented, it depends on what cultures had it at that time. Depending on pre or post flood. If the wheel was pre-flood, Noah would have had it, and all the cultures afterwards would have had it. That would have meant, yeah, right? It just logically follows, I would think. But if it was post, I want to know when post-flood it was invented, because then you really got to start digging into who had the wheel at what time post-flood and who didn't. But there was a lot of amazing structures pre-flood, according to them. And I hate to say Göbekli Tepe, Serengeti, Turkey, for instance, is just right now being dug up. The ancient sites there are fucking just awesome, what we're finding out now in Turkey. And it's amazing. And so when you get a young earth creationist off of their Bible a little bit, and you get them off of their, what they would call science, and you just say, hey, let's look at this historically. What can I look at your timeline historically for this, and this? Things seem to change a little bit, and you tend to get made fun of, and they find faults for you that don't have anything to do with that. So that's pretty much where I was at tonight, and I didn't get any answers. And then the only Christian I know that would answer something if I asked him honestly would have been Richard. So I asked him, and
I'm gonna.
Here we are. Yeah, here we are.
Okay, so I think there's some fundamental errors that Christians who maintain a young earth are making, and by that I mean that there's no such claim in the Bible. This estimate of the age of the earth thing was postulated, I think the late 1200s, early 1300s, something like that. People before that would have never considered that sort of a claim.
No, from what I understand, and something I saw this week, a lot of the Jewish faith would have considered Genesis to be a beginning as opposed to the beginning, which would make a hell of a lot more sense when you read it that way.
It surely would. Yeah. The Jewish people that I know and get to speak with are philosophical. Like, they don't think that there is a part of it that's meant to be taken literally, of the Old Testament. That's not the way they look at it. More like deep human introspect, something more like that. So
yeah, that's kind of how I took it too.
Yeah, they're more like it's like a different version of Buddhism, really.
I was about to say the same thing.
Oh, well, okay. Well, great minds think alike and all that. Or really bad ones. I can't tell. We'll figure that out.
Probably
some other
bad
time.
because
Probably bad.
I
ones,
like
yeah.
Buddhism is cool, but I like weedism, you know. So
Weed is. Is that related to that sect Mary Janeism?
yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Okay, weedism is it an offshoot or is it primary to Mary Jane? Anyway, bad jokes. Anyway, moving on.
I mean, we can go biblically if I have to on this.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So here's what I want to make sure that I don't sound like. There are very, and I'm not saying I'm a very smart person, but there are very smart people who work very hard at reading the Bible and trying to make it make sense in the natural world.
Sure.
And then there's people that bite the bullet and they just go, well, it doesn't make sense to what we see exactly, but it's not meant to. That's more like a traditional Jewish approach. And then you have some sects of Christianity, like newer young earth creationists, which don't want to bite the bullet and say, well, that's not what it's about. But they still want to justify it to their surroundings that they actually see. And I think that's the problem right there, because you can't do both.
No, you can't. I think that's the problem too. You sit here and you want to give us science and stuff, and I say, okay, well, what if your science is all correct, but then it never fits in historically?
Right.
I mean, we do know some things historically, but that was my whole point. Was I was trying to ask the people inside chat, hey, if you're YEC, when was the wheel created? Why is that so hard?
Maybe I should rename this stream "Calling All YECs" and see if someone will come in and actually just actually present something that makes sense.
Standing for Truth wouldn't do it.
No way.
Straw Mat wouldn't do it. I think he was in the side chat. And then there's some
Straw Mat.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
Vampire Matt, because he's awfully white. But
Jamie Russell. How about Jamie Russell? He's a young earth creationist. Can we bring him in? Is that cool?
Yeah, man. I don't care who. I'm interested in finding out what they think their history actually is.
Well, Jamie, did you hear the question? Go ahead and come on in. We'll brief you. Yeah, so I actually think that what the Bible is describing is a series of stories that do make sense in reality to me. Peace and respect, Cryptomeria. But it's not talking about a lineage of people, and here's why I say that. I would even let me bring up this example of it. This is
the
lineage of Genesis 5. You see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so the blue words here are for English, so it flows easier, but you can read it without them, and it's fine. It's just a bit chunky, I'm going to read it without the blue words, but a person's welcome to stick them in there. I think that they're not too assumptive. Like there's no major new ideas with the blue words that I stuck in there. And I think that they're necessary, not much guesswork. So this is the lineage that you can read in Genesis 5, the sons of Adam. And if you look at the definitions of the actual names, this is those same definitions exactly in the order given. Just one word definitions for the names. Mankind changed undignified, changed a builder changed mortal, fixed a builder mortal, unchangeable glorify, mortal unchangeable, glorify a builder unchangeable, glorified dissension, the builders glorify dissension initiation. A dissension initiate builders dissension initiation, warriors initiating gods of the Most High God, warriors builders, The builders initiated angels, angels taken warriors, warriors technology, technology builders, warriors technology, the builders rest, rest anointed, demonic expansion, temptation. That's Genesis 5. If a person, and that was part of the lineage that they would have read, if a person reads that as if it's a list of names, that's kind of nonsensical as a list of names.
It sounds like a structure.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely a little tiny story right there. But these are the things that they added up to get the 6,000 years. They added up this list as if it's people when it's not actually a list of names.
No, it sounds like when I say structure, I mean like a foundation of something. They're building humans. What?
Right.
Building kept coming up in what you said.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's what rings to my mind.
Well, the whole idea of sun is a family building block, or it adds to your house. Peace and respect, Jamie.
House being family or non-physical.
Right. Yeah, the concept of the family, made up of people.
Oh, you did a lineage, a translation of the transliterated names of Genesis 5, right?
That's what that was, yeah.
You've seen the other ones that people have presented before, right? On that one?
Well, I've done a lot of them myself. I've not looked what other people...
Oh, I can tell you right off the top of my head if you want.
Oh, help yourself. Go ahead.
It is interesting. So the 10 names in Genesis 5, the Patriarchs, some of them are hard to translate because of like Canaan can be... And,
Maynard James Keenan?
Enos. Or,
no, not that Keenan.
Oh.
But one potential, I've looked into this a little bit, and so I have a list with the uncertain ones taken out. But if you take a couple of what's the word? If you presume a particular etymology or whatever, then one of the ways people translate it would be man, appointed, and those two are obvious because it says Adam means man, and then Seth, it says Eve says, for God has appointed me
a man. Yeah.
So man, appointed, and then the next two are kind of iffy. Mortal, sorrow,
right.
And then it says, and then Mahalalel would be the blessed God,
right.
And then Yared is, we know that one because that's why they did the story about the fallen angels coming down in the days of Jared. So it's shall come down. So I'll just read them off. The blessed man appointed mortal sorrow, the blessed God shall come down, teaching or proclaiming that at his death it shall bring the despairing rest.
That's pretty much what I have, yeah.
Which is kind of like a synopsis of the plan of salvation, I would say.
All right. Well, if we're getting into Genesis 5, at the beginning of Genesis 6, what's the Hebrew word for in?
I'll have to look it up.
I-N, that would have been translated to the King James, would use the word in.
Yeah, I don't know.
I've always wondered this. Just
I'll look it up for you while you guys are talking about the wagon wheel or wheels. I'll look this up for you. What is it you want to know of Genesis 6?
I believe it's in 6:1. Giants were in or on. What's the Hebrew word used there?
Okay, I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't a direct translated word there. It's probably a interpolation or something.
I was just curious since you guys brought up the 5, but that wasn't my point this evening. Although that's one of my main points usually.
Well, hit me with your objection or whatever. I probably missed. I had just popped in when I heard you guys talking.
Are you are a young Earth creationist?
Yeah, I am.
Okay. You take the Bible literally?
As
in like a Kent Hovind literal, or
Somewhat, I would,
There's-
yeah, somewhat. Although my tradition would be probably surprisingly less rigid in that sense. Like,
Okay, I just don't want to straw man you in your belief of or how you interpret the Bible. So,
yeah, I'm not a Baptist,
right.
but
I grew up in a Baptist family, and none of them were young Earth.
yeah, I mean, I guess the Baptist type, young Earth type. I mean, I am in a lot of ways, but I might be.
Well, I grew up in a Baptist home, and 8 out of my 10 family members, including my mom, dad, my older brother, and my aunts and uncles, were all public educators.
Yeah.
So I had never even heard of young Earth until, well, when I was into atheism.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, like
Baptists
back
are
in
like
the early 90s. Well, probably the 80s, but
yeah, Baptists are very diverse in their because they're like the largest.
yeah, we were definitely they called it the North American Baptists.
Okay.
They had like conferences aligned with Canadian Baptists and stuff like that. So
So
it was no.
more liberal type Baptist, then I guess you could say maybe, or no?
They started with no dancing, that type of shit, but it eased up as it went, and then everybody loosened up to no denomination. So.
Gotcha.
Well, they had to, yeah, you got to keep up with the times, like everybody, I guess, right?
Yeah, some people would call it compromise. I would say I'm on the liberal side of my background, but I'm sure it wouldn't seem liberal to most people.
Gotcha. So you do you take a King James literal version?
I think King James onlyism is rather foolish.
Okay. No, I don't have a problem with that.
But I do prefer that line of manuscripts. But I would say it's useful to be looking at every manuscript. But I do actually prefer it. But I use the New King James or ESV, or I'm not afraid of the NIV and stuff like that. So
I gotcha. I'd rather stick with the KGB. I mean, I think I know that better than.
Sure.
But my question that brought up the stream with Richard was where do young Earth creationists historically put the invention of the wheel?
I think some people say that it's that it may.
Well, how about you? What about you? Since you and I are talking,
I can't remember. Like, it seems like it was something like, well, like I remember there being certain cultures that are fairly late that didn't even have the wheel, like the Mayans, for instance, if I remember right. And so I don't remember, but I don't think it was too deep into history, was it? I don't know. What do they say about that now? I'm not sure.
No, I'm asking you as a young Earth creationist. I'm asking your view of history.
Yeah, so I don't know. I would probably imagine it would be somewhere around.
History is not very important when it comes to young Earth creationism.
Just no, I would say with that, I'm just not sure. It's something I don't know. I would guess it would be somewhere around 2000 BC, maybe. That's my best guess.
So you're talking after the flood? The flood being 4,500 years ago, according to most YECs. I don't want to straw man that, if that's wrong.
Well, I'm just being honest. I haven't really thought about that question other than.
That's why I'm asking you.
So I would guess that they likely had the wheel before that, actually. But as far as what they say
before the flood or after the flood?
Well, yeah. See, I don't know. I don't know, but I would imagine that it's likely that. So I would take a position that man was advanced before the flood. So I would imagine that they probably did have a wheel before the flood, and then after that, it may not have been reinvented or whatever in most of the world.
Why do you think history is not important to most YECs?
It is important.
That's too broad of a question.
I wouldn't say it's not important. I wouldn't say that.
All right. I didn't frame it very well. I'll ask something else. So if the wheel had been invented pre-flood, how did Aztecs, Incas in the Americas not have the wheel? If the wheel was used post-flood to build up, what would it be, Egypt? And how many other countless cities, nations before they got to the Americas? And just curious, in when do you think post-flood maybe they got to the Americas?
So I would think that there was a land bridge of some kind, and then because it seems to suggest that in the Bible, right?
I mean, I could think of a lot of other things too, like, but that doesn't.
Probably, through like what the Bering Strait or whatever it is. Isn't that what? I would think, as far as the wheel thing goes, I would think a likely way it would go would be that people dispersed in certain groups, grew up out of.
How much time do you think that took after they started building the ziggurat or Babylon, the tower? Like, how much time do you think they spent there before they could actually amass enough people to traverse through the Bering Sea and back down into South America?
Several centuries, I would imagine. Several centuries. I don't.
You think you could amass enough people to build the tower? You could build Egypt in a couple of centuries?
Yeah.
No.
Why not?
Not according to the if you go to like an AIG or whatever their population rate is. You're talking about 8 people getting off in 4,500.
Yeah, I mean, I would.
That's 2,500 BC.
How many generations? I mean, we can do the math. I mean,
Please do it for me. I'd love to hear it.
Well, I'm just thinking they probably having kids like every 20 years, right? Another generation or so, maybe even
Sure.
sooner. So
Sure.
And then you have exponential growth. So
I see your face, Midnight.
There would be three sets to start
Thank
with,
you.
right? And they have, say, 10 kids each or something like that.
10 kids each to start with.
Probably.
I mean,
How do you get probably?
Well, because I'm saying I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. I would
10 kids each couple starting out kind of. I'll go with that. I don't think that's even close to possible. So I'll go with that.
Why would you think that wouldn't be possible? People have 10 kids today. I would think they were more genetically viable. If
Are you saying it as an average, like a worldwide reproduction average of 10 per 2?
Well, yeah, I'm saying there's 3 couples that the Bible says would bear children after the flood, right? The 3 sons and their wives. So they each have 10. 20 years later, now you have 15 sets of potential people. And let's
safely, it could be 6. It could be as little as 16 years.
Sure.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, that's like
okay.
6 exponential. It's like it'd be 15 couples. Then you'd have 150. Then you'd have 75 times 750. So, I mean, after like 6 generations, you'd have a couple thousand people, and that's only
great.
That's 120 years.
That's fine, but let's deal with the cities that were occupied, built, and being run at the time before they went across the bridge and got to South America. With no wheel, since they would have had they would have known about the wheel, but they didn't choose to imply it.
And you consider the structures that would be on a young Earth model, the structures like in Machu Picchu and places like that, which I would think would have to be after the flood, although it's not necessarily the case, but I would suspect.
Right, but they could build the Tower of Babylon that was so big that God had to strike it down.
Right. I don't see any problem with having enough people, especially.
So all these other structures in like Europe and Siberia, everywhere had to be built post-flood before anybody got to the Americas to build the great structures that we see now.
Hey, gentlemen, I'm going to interrupt.
There's not enough time.
I'm going to interrupt you for just a second. I think we have a lag in the conversation. and from perception of watching the video, and I'm not picking on anybody, Maynard, it's by the time I hear Jamie, he hasn't even finished a sentence you've started. So I think there's a lag somewhere. So it may not even be you, Maynard, but I'm going to ask you to give it just one more second before you start talking. Okay.
Okay, I apologize.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you for your kindness.
I can imagine after 120 years, you'd have enough people to actually disperse in some sort of feasible way. And then you add another 150 years, you could have the same numbers in each spot that they could travel to. It just seems like it might be, it seems that it would be maybe surprising, but that you could have, on every continent within 200 or 300 years, seems like you could have populations in the tens of thousands within 500 years.
I'm sorry, I cut him off that time, Richard. I apologize.
No, you're fine. I'm done.
Look, I think that might be arguments from incredulity, because I don't understand why they would have the wheel pre-flood, post-flood, but those who journeyed and trekked into the Americas wouldn't bring that technology with them when we see the structures that are built now without the wheel.
Yeah, totally. I get what you're saying. Like, why wouldn't that go with them as they dispersed? And then why wouldn't they have it? I would, like I said, this is all speculation, but it seems like maybe as they disperse, you would have, concentrations of people that were directly related to the original group that came out, that built the Tower of Babel. And then along the way, you could have like little side groups that were popping off that were maybe like, that ended inbreeding, and you get the populations of like Neanderthals, stuff like that.
Is that where you have to go?
Well, I would suspect that would be the only way to explain those sorts of things, like these people.
If that's, I'm cool with that. If that's where you have to go to explain that, then I'm all set. I've got my answer. I'm good.
Can I step in for a second? How you doing, Richard?
Peace and respect, Midnight. What's up, man?
Is this Moonlight Sparkle?
I mean,
Twinkle?
Yes.
That's wrong. It's wrong either way.
Well, no, I mean, you asked me before to turn on my camera. Did you have an imposter that it was? I don't know. There was, I never had to do that before when I came in your stream.
No porn bombing, Midnight.
I know it's tedious, but it stops porn bombers. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I would never do that. And to be honest,
you wouldn't. Someone would imitate you so they could do it. I don't think you would do it.
Right, but Richard, who would it? Who would? Never mind. I get the point. I can't speak well. I mean, I was gonna say, who would impersonate me?
Creation thing. So the young
Earth. What's your question?
No, that was it. That's the question.
Okay.
I'd be happy to offer that. Probably the hardest question to answer would be like, it seems that the pyramids were built very much close to any kind of biblical dating after the flood, and so having enough people to build the pyramids after the flood is probably one of the harder questions.
You think so?
It seems like getting anything to work after the flood would be nothing short of a miracle. I mean, besides the fact that how the flood occurs itself wouldn't ever occur in a million years, but
you're not going to take the wheel with you when you traverse I don't know how many thousands of miles. You're not going to take any inventions with you over there, and then all of a sudden you're going to build wonderful things over there, like in Sacsayhuaman and Cusco. It's just,
there's an obvious question too. There's a surprising question too. I'm surprised you didn't ask, which is, where's all this wood coming from?
Trees. I mean,
okay, but like remember.
It seems like an innocuous question, dude. Where's the wood coming from? Trees.
Okay, but remember, you wouldn't have trees left after the flood, because this flood has been going nonstop. It's going to have ruined any of the trees that are left.
I mean, yeah, after the flood, but I thought you were talking about before the flood. And
no. I'm talking about post-flood, because you wouldn't have trees. You wouldn't have any kind of plants that
you wouldn't have the fungus. You wouldn't have mycelium. You wouldn't have
Actually, the
You would have
theory-
caused.
spores that are needed that created everything. Fungus is something that would have been destroyed.
well, that's making certain assumptions. I would say
it
they'd
would
probably
it
be
would
floating
essentially
around.
it would essentially be destroying the entire ecosystem.
Making assumptions about what? How plants reproduce and how if you overfill a plant with water, then it dies?
Well, it's,
We know that
Can't
they can't
regulate
live
its own
that way.
water intake?
no. Presumably, you would have like mats and floating debris that could harbor, plants that without dying. So then
Okay, but that's not going to help you too much though, because a tree has to be rooted to the ground, right? And even if that were the case, right?
Eventually.
Even if there are trees that are rooted to the ground, they're not going to thrive because this flood, right, it's nonstop raining. So there's not going to be any light that's penetrating through the Earth's atmosphere. There's going to be no photosynthesis that's occurring. These
Well-
trees are all still going to die. Anything that's photosynthetic is going to go extinct.
But my whole point to this was not even to come at it scientifically, other than the fact of a historic. Why wouldn't you bring a wheel with you? And along the way,
Yeah, I get the point there. I mean, I'm just
why
trying to point
doesn't
out.
anything from YEC fit into history as we know it? Why were they? I was in SFG's channel. Richard saw me, and I asked them over, and they kept giving me shit. Nobody wanted to tell me because it doesn't matter when the wheel was invented. Well, yeah, because they don't want to lock down to a specific history, and that's what I'm trying to do is to find out what their timeline is. Not necessarily scientific. I want to know what the fuck the timeline is because it doesn't add
Good luck
up.
with that.
I'm
luck with that.
interested. I'm interested in the timeline too, but I'm also interested in seeing how in the world they're getting this done. Like, given what the world looks like post-flood or even pre-flood.
No,
Because-
I get it.
Because I mean, there's a lot of things. Like, you'll see some young Earth creationists posit the fact like that there's an ice age almost immediately after the flood event, which is like, okay, how in the world is
That's
that
highly
supposed to
debated.
occur?
Seems to
Yeah,
be.
And how did that wouldn't have killed off the 8 people that got off the ark?
Okay, but wait a minute. When we look at some of these places, like in like Mexico or like Latin America or whatever, it seems like there's more advanced building, and then we see like lesser building on top of it. Like, how do you guys explain that? Why were they better in the distant past than they were in the recent past?
Because there were lost civilizations.
Right, and I would
Because
say the same thing. That's how they probably had the wheel.
I'm an
originally.
ancient alienist.
There
Not
doesn't-
really,
doesn't-
but
I'm just
yeah.
saying,
I would
they
say
had the wheel, and then they like groups broke off and didn't lost that technology or whatever, and they somehow got less advanced, or they had collapses in their civilization, and then you lose people with the knowledge. So, I mean, the same thing that we kind of just see anyway.
But it doesn't make sense though. It's like
So
you would think. Okay,
thinkers could build polygonal walls, and they could meld all these things together, but they had no wheel, according to YEC.
I feel like that explanation doesn't work because it's like, okay, yes, certain things historically are lost, but it's like, why would you, like, for instance, let's say boats, for instance, you would need a boat to get from like one area to another area, but then you're positing that these people lost the ability to manufacture that technology,
No,
but then
'cause
somehow or
let's
another
say-
regained the technology at some unknown later point in the future.
well, the ice
Or
age,
Let's say they
technologically
traversed the
consistent?
ice.
the ice
They
age
would have
also-
pulled a cart that had
No.
wheels.
Yeah,
They would have
suspect they
pulled
had
that with them, but then they get to the Americas and just forget everything about the wheel.
No, but
Apparently.
well, apparently, if there's an ice age after the flood, then that could be storing up the water and that create land bridges, and then it's slowly melting, and that could be what divided.
What are they using to get across the land bridges? What are they pulling all their
I
gear and
suspect they
shit
would
with?
have wheels. I would suspect they would have had wheels.
Were there not chariots?
How do you prove no one in the past had wheels when they say they didn't? I mean, I don't know.
I mean, wouldn't you find like remnants of like decaying wood in caves dispersed,
I would suspect
like dispersed throughout
so. I would
areas,
suspect
like
so.
in uniform?
From the
and-
great traumatic flood?
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
how did
I mean-
the Aztecs build without wheels? They say they didn't have any wheels. How did they build all these amazing things without wheels? I mean, I don't know. Maybe they did have wheels. I don't
And
know.
it's a marvel. It's a marvel of history. I mean, they had technology that's available to them, and part of that is based upon what resources they have and the reliability and accessibility of engineering and scientific knowledge they had in civilizations. And certain civilizations pass that knowledge on and develop it at different rates. And the fact that information back in that days couldn't be spread as quickly as it was nowadays kind of seems to account as to why different areas develop technology at a different gradient.
Well, sure.
That is until you consider, this
God's
new age where information can be spread almost instantaneously.
Well, I mean, that seems like I can just appeal to the same thing. I mean, God, it says that God confuses their languages and then they're forced to go their separate ways. Maybe some of the groups had that technology and some didn't. I mean, I don't know.
But the issue seems to be, though, right, that it's like there are certain things that are going to be universal to events after the flood where all civilizations should have that technology.
Yeah, they'd see it, right? Yeah, I agree.
Right. But then at some point or another, right, to remain consistent with archaeology and history, they would have to then lose that knowledge and rediscover it at some point in time.
Yeah, that's a problem. Because how do you lose the wheel as technology, right? I mean,
precisely.
Once you have it.
Exactly, and that's the point. It's like it doesn't make sense on a logical basis.
That was my point.
It doesn't make sense that a civilization would have a technology, lose it for some apparent reason, and then redevelop it. Like there's no precedent to assume that.
Like they wouldn't take chariots with them. Like they wouldn't pull trailers. They wouldn't across this land bridge, whatever it was, whatever you guys choose to use.
Well, it'd be nice to see a map with like the with the timeline that shows the different places in comparison to each other, and look at that and see like who are the historians saying didn't have a wheel, who did, when and where, and then try to make a model from that. But I mean, I just don't know enough about it to even really speculate very well.
How about Sumerians 6,000 years ago?
Right. Well, that would be maybe I'm not the best person to even talk about this. I suspect that's pre-flood or whatever. I don't know. I haven't really thought about it.
I can see why nobody wanted to answer this in Standing for Truth channel.
The thing is, right, and this is my opinion. I mean, I think young earthers are very much invested in protecting and understanding the history of the Bible through a literalistic framework. But part of that means that they're going to encounter a heck of a lot of issues in terms of what happens when you consider the history of other cultures, and especially like with the point you're raising about technology. Because from a modern historical standpoint, it makes sense that people don't have certain technologies. Number one, people didn't know, like in the Middle East, that people like Indians, like in the Americas, existed, and things like that.
Well,
so
it makes sense. It makes sense that people left before the invention of the wheel, which is why different technologies started at different times in different places.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, it adds up from that perspective, but the perspective of, there being this like massive period of, excessive inbreeding to produce a lot of genetic diversity for those people then to migrate, over land bridge, across the world.
And just to have a massive bottleneck right there of technology, of people. You're talking about a family that brought technology that built the best boat ever in the history of Well, and the more, so you're talking about a family that has engineering techniques that are well beyond anything.
Or at least would have learned them in the building of it.
And here's the more astounding part of it, because if you're assuming like an exponential growth rate, part of the assumption there is that no organism in that population dies. And that's
or doesn't not reproduce.
Right. It's just not realistic. I mean, if the genetic entropy thesis is anywhere near correct, it'd be a very small population. It'd be a fraction of the bottleneck that reproduces, within that population. It wouldn't be the majority.
I don't think people would be able to reproduce that. Well, especially when you figure into birth rate death at that time.
Well, yeah, I mean,
maternal death at that time.
Yeah, you brought up the point of people having 10 children. Well, the reason they would do that, and I mean, even up to like the 1900s, people would do that as well.
Yeah, they lost 8 of them.
Yeah, but they're doing
Precisely.
that because they're losing so many kids. I would say the better model, the better young Earth model with genetic entropy as a factor or whatever, you still have this kind of flipping over of genetic viability being worse.
Okay,
not constantly getting worse in the sense that like there's like kind of a turning point where you have you reach a point where it's not as viable or whatever.
Okay, but scale that back though, right? Like if it's true, like what we know about the past, like say the past 100 years, like that you have 10 kids, okay, 8 of them die, 2 of them survive. We're talking about with the population post flood that you're needing hundreds of thousands of people. That means that these people are producing like millions of kids on average.
Well, if they're more genetically viable, it seems totally plausible that that's even an underestimate or whatever what I was suggesting.
Okay, but the issue, number one, I think the land itself is going to be an issue in terms of the fact that the flood's going to have decimated things to the point where it can't grow food. But number two, what is happening what's happening? But the other thing is what's happening with these women here, right? It's not like this has like hundreds of thousands of years to occur.
Well,
like
they got wide hips, my friend, wide hips.
They do, but you're talking about like when a woman's giving birth, like she's giving birth to like 100 women at a time, like 100 children, if not more, at a time to sustain that kind of population, right?
What are they bringing with them across their journey across this frozen land barrier, so to speak? While all the animals are trying to traverse to Australia, if you're kangaroos, koalas.
I know this. They had a stick and a handkerchief and their King James Bible. That's what they had.
Okay, but I mean, that's another point though too, right? Like, think about the logistics of basic travel, right? Let's pretend they're not using any form of sophisticated travel like a wagon or whatever. You have hundreds of thousands of people migrating across a continent. Where's all this food coming from? Like, are these people cannibalizing each other? Did cows just start?
It's a good question. I don't know.
Did cows start falling from the sky? Is fruit just like magically popping up out of the ground?
I know, man.
I mean,
it was man.
I just.
Sorry, I'll stop.
No, it's just.
Manna from heaven.
Look, I mean, maybe the young Earth timeline can work, but it's like it's astounding.
They always try to come up with science for the young Earth creation, but they never try to come with like a historical, accurate timeline because they can't produce it. That's why nobody in SFT's chat would answer my question. They kept wanting to know, where are you going with it? Where are you going with it? She said, just answer it.
Where you're
according
going
to your belief. Yeah, that's where I went with it.
And where you're going with it is just that to most extents, without appealing to miracles left and right, this all appears, for all intents and purposes, impossible. Right? It just doesn't seem something that's like feasible in any real sense of the way.
What's wrong with appealing to miracles every whip stitch if that's what's needed, though?
Even if there were miracles, right? Like with the case of like manna or God like providing wood and stuff like that.
Why would that be needed?
Well, you would need it for the fact that, number one, the flood would have created a world where food would not be able to grow adequately. You wouldn't have enough resources for animals to reproduce. You wouldn't have enough trees or biological matter to, create wood to create wagons and things like that. So
right. But if you wanna go back and say, okay, miracles can happen or whatever, then I'm just out. I mean, then we just snap our fingers and we just apply magic wherever we need to, and then that's insufficient for me.
No one's trying to do that. I would say most likely animals, like, I don't know, I've seen studies about animals like when there's like been a disaster, like suddenly like birth rates will explode for animals, like, and they'll fill the niche or whatever after like, say like Mount St. Helens or whatever, right? Like the elk population was able to like bounce back like on a level like not even thought possible. And this is now presumably, if young Earth is true, right? Like they would probably have that even more of that ability in the past. And so I would say when they're sitting there on the plain gathering and disobeying God, building the tower, whatever, the animals are already dispersing out into the world, probably very quickly, like beyond what we would suspect or expect. And then
Why?
so then as they disperse, well, because that's what animals do. We have evidence of that. And presumably
Well-
they're going to be more viable at that time.
Because they can do it doesn't mean that they did do it.
Well, and keep in mind something, right? Like when you bring up like any kind of like ecological disaster or catastrophe, right? The reason organisms can still survive after that is, sure, organisms are going to die, but the thing is that area where that disaster occurred is surrounding other areas where other resources for those animals are still very vast and sufficient, right?
Yeah,
so
I
they
would
may have
s-
to retreat temporarily, but they don't need to be, in that environment. With the
Excuse me,
worldwide
guys.
flood, sure.
I'm sorry, real quick. Richard, I got to duck out. I got a
Pardon me.
family thing I got to take care of for a few. If you're on still in the next 20 and a half hour, I'll pop back on if I can.
We might let you back in. I don't know.
But yeah,
I appreciate it. Thank you, Immutable
sure.
and Jamie.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
but
not
my
the best
point in
person to defend it, so.
no, I think most young Earthers, if you hold their feet to the fire, in terms of what's happening after the flood or some of the logistics that have to go into this, they all have this kind of issue because they're worried about certain features of the Bible, like the interpretation of a global flood occurring, right?
Right.
And after that, they don't seem to care very much about how things come and manifest, which, I mean, it's a consideration for how stuff is supposed to work, but
Well,
I would just say it's easier to say, hey, look, the creation part is true, but the Earth is probably old, right? If that's the case, if things are adding up in this kind of way, okay, maybe there's not enough time, for all this to happen in a 6,000-year window, but maybe over time you have trees growing, you have populations develop in new areas, things that equilibrate back to normal.
Yeah, I think the plant question, like the dispersing of the plants after the flood, is one of the more difficult questions. I haven't really looked into it a lot, but I would suspect that it would have to be something like where the plants could wouldn't have to spread from seed dropping around all the land masses or whatever, because obviously there's certain plants on certain continents and whatnot, and that just wouldn't work. So it seems to me they'd have to have somehow survived and just kind of had a dispersion, as the waters receded, like on mats or something, or like the seed was more capable of doing that or whatever. I'm not sure. I mean, if we look at it, presumably the coal beds and stuff are obviously some sort of mass of material that, if the flood is true, right, those would be the same kind of thing. And so maybe some of that was on the surface and we wouldn't really see evidence of that today, but that could have been holding that kind of genetic material, plants or whatever. I don't know. I mean, you could probably look at studies and see how, different species of plants stretch across continents or whatever, and kind of trace it back a little.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a plant geneticist or anything like that. I mean, I'm sure the history and diversification of various plant species across various areas is quite diverse.
Yeah, and you see connections and stuff, and there's interesting things like that with animal studies too. Like, the idea of how apes or whatever get to South America is kind of weird on an evolutionary model, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, though, I mean, and I'm not, again, right, I mean, I'm taking what people say about this at their value, but to what we can tell, it appears to be supported by data, right? The genetic evidence and data that, from primatology and stuff like that, it appears to accord with that. And there might be parts of that that need to be reworked or more carefully, determined as more genomic data comes in. But for the most part, I mean, it seems to be what's being predicted appears to be relatively stable in terms of the results that are coming.
I think Standing for Truth does a good job of showing some evidence that's actually more inclined to fit with the young Earth model, surprisingly, like with the mitochondrial DNA and the measured rates we see today. It kind of fits.
Yeah, I know
model.
that there are. So I know for a fact that particularly, and I'd have to go into the genetics and contacts and people that do actually work with this data. But if it's using the D loop of mitochondria, it's notoriously highly prone to mutation in an unstable way, right? And for the most part, with a lot of creationists that I've seen push that argument, that's the particular area of the mitochondrial genome they're wanting to take it from. And even to a more general point, right? Like that may be true, right? I don't know enough about it to assess it, but even if it were true, right? What should be the case if things are occurring in that type of way, right, to support a 6,000-year Earth or something like that, right, is it shouldn't just be one region of a mitochondrial genome that's doing that, right? It should be the whole genome that's doing that, right? There should be a universal selection pressure for that genome, not just a particular loci or some particular region of mitochondrial DNA.
Right. The way I understand it, though, is that based on what we see happening, like as far as from generation to generation, it'd be hard to explain if it's been going on for so long that the diversity is so low for what is measured by what we measure now, especially if modern humans have been around for 200,000 years or whatever. It's also all written accounts of history and stuff from the different cultures seems to fit a biblical model, or at least like in the right order of magnitude. You wonder why modern brain size could be around for 200,000 years, but it takes this bottleneck of humans, or they don't invent farming till the last 10,000 years of the 200,000 years that they have the modern capability, the cognitive faculty. I've always thought that was baffling.
Yeah, I mean, there's things, look, if everything was predictable in science, we wouldn't have job security, right? I mean, the fact that nature continues to surprise us is something that's useful.
Well, even more surprising, though, is that these anomalies would happen to fit a biblical model.
I mean, except for I don't know where the Bible predicts that explicitly, right? Like, there's certain things creationists will say about organisms and about how populations will behave, but that appears to be because certain data is coming out, and they're saying, "Oh, well, that's interesting. How do we make the biblical timeline accord with that data, right? How do we strike harmony?"
It's a great time to ask this question of both of you guys.
Sure.
Where's your hinge pin, or what would change your position?
What would change my position? I mean, there's a number of things. I mean, the thing that Aaron Ra brings up about the phylogeny challenge, right? Like, if you can show me a particular species that fails to obey what we know about evolution in terms of its phylogeny, in terms of nesting within families and things like that, then sure, that would break it. Another thing that might break it is, look, you show me a decay rate, of a radioactive isotope change, right, where that type of thing has been measured, that would do it, right? Because that would very heavily, imply that certain aspects, like of fundamental physics, are wrong. You show me, like, there's many things that could do that.
I don't think the decay rates change per se, or like the speed of light changes. I think it was a different process that occurred during the flood that probably made larger isotopes that broke down into what we see today. But
there's no reason to. I mean, if you're going off of that because of like the thing like with the decay rate team, they even stated that there's no known mechanism, and they can't think of a mechanism that would cause that. Right, that would cause the abundance. Right, they can't think of a mechanism that would cause radioactive abundance, or rather the decay of parent isotope into daughter isotope to accelerate, right? And think about it too, right? Because creationists will bring up this point about how, oh, well, if they did find it, it'd be a conspiracy. I don't think so, because the nuclear, well, I mean, a lot of people though will, because they think that, that atheists and non-believers or whatever don't want to accept the truth, and of their interpretation of the Bible and its history. But if you could actually speed up the rate at which parent isotopes decay into daughter isotopes, heck, nuclear fusion would be a breeze, right? That'd be
and we could get rid of a lot of nuclear waste very easily and quickly.
Oh yeah, I mean, it'd be
I actually think there was
the-
a fusion process. I just think it happened on such a massive scale during the flood. So I like the hydroplate theory on the creation of heavy ice.
Okay, but I mean, the thing is though, like, that still doesn't really account for it, because what is it about that that's special? Okay, areas of high pressure. Stars are also area of high pressure, right? And stars can create material, right? Can create atoms that have
No doubt.
that are radiogenic, right? And you don't see, right? Like, we don't see certain processes within stars that cause those elements to form. Usually, at least, or to my knowledge, you don't
really
see.
get anything over iron normally, unless you have a really massive.
Yeah. But even in the cases like where you don't have iron, right? Like potassium or stuff like that, right? There's radioactive like nuclides of those species,
Or
but
how
you
about
don't see
the,
them forming in
phosphorus?
high abundance.
Well, how do we get so much phosphorus on Earth?
How much phosphorus?
Have you heard of the phosphorus problem?
No, I haven't.
No, the creationists don't really talk about it, but it's more of like an issue with like we see no phosphorus like being formed in abundance anywhere. Like I think in space or whatever, and there seems to be, it's like a necessary thing for biology or whatever, and it gets used up or whatever too, and so that's an issue. But I'm still looking into that. It's more of a different kind of argument. It's one of the Fermi paradoxes or whatever, or one of the issues.
Yeah, I don't know. Like,
But-
it's
But why?
There-
Let me ask you one question on that real quick before
Sure.
we go into something else. So one of the issues I see with I understand that stars potentially and supernova and all that.
yeah.
But I mean, that would be like just so type of thing for it to all work out on Earth. And we don't see any real evidence in the nearby galaxy of that sort of thing happening recently, and cosmic.
Yeah, we do.
Like what?
I mean, do you know, for instance, like let's go something more broad first. Like when we talk about like detecting things in outer space, like stellar processes that cause certain molecules to form, do you know how we detect those things?
Just go ahead and tell us.
Light. What do you mean? Detect those processes?
How do we like when I say something like an amino acid has forms like in a nebular disk or something like that? How is it that I know that process has actually occurred? Right? What method am I using to determine that?
Not sure.
So I'll tell you. There's various forms of spectroscopy, which, as you mentioned correctly, right? It's the utilization of light, particularly when certain elements are formed, and when particular molecules are formed, they get excited by light and they release energy. Yeah, so they release photons of light at specific frequencies. Some of those frequencies happen to be within the visible range that we can detect. And we can detect in certain stars, right, based upon the life cycle that they're in, what types of elements they're synthesizing.
Right,
Because
because each
the emission-
element has a dark spot in the spectrum.
Precisely.
It's their,
Right.
If
so-
you want to know more
Actually,
about
Adam,
this,
ahead of
guys,
me.
just a second. If you want to know more about this in the side chat, just look up Fraunhofer lines.
Right, and so what particularly we're looking at when we're looking at stages of like stellar development and things of that nature, right, is we're looking at what are called emission spectra of atoms, because since these stars are forming various kinds of atoms, various atoms when they're struck by light emit certain frequencies of light in response to that, and that light has a certain color which we can observe to this day, right? So we do know that certain stars are producing
certain elements, right?
are producing certain elements, and we can do a little bit better than that though.
They even do
Because
the
we
redshift.
do
right?
know. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You just
and
shift it over, and then it's the redshift and all that, right?
Yeah. And what's also interesting about that too is that to some extent, we can tell when nebulae and when certain galaxies form, and the reason for that is due to gravity. Certain galaxies will merge together, and in the result, it destroys a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff gets lost because the collision isn't perfect. But in the result, right, you have new nebulas form and things of that nature, which start fusing new elements. So, and there's ways in which astronomers can detect that type of thing. So yeah, we do know those things. We do know that certain elements are forming, and we can do that by various means of spectroscopy, usually.
Yeah, I don't I understand that. I accept that. But
maybe that answered your question. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, but I was gonna say, yeah, I understand that. I just remember I was just kind of talking off the cuff as far as the kind of energy needed to produce elements that we see, quote unquote, in abundance or whatever, or in enough quantity to know that they would have had to been formed nearby potentially. And one of the problems I think, if I recall, is the fact that all these heavy elements seem to be more concentrated on the surface of the Earth, but presumably they would have had to been created in this star event, and you'd think on a molten Earth, when did these elements come to the Earth? They're in the surface. If the Earth was molten, it seems like they would have sunk into the Earth deeper, not be all scattered on the surface, things like that.
Well, I mean, that's bringing a lot of different things. So when we talk about, this is my speculation, I'm not a geochemist or a geophysicist, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But for instance, if you're talking about why is the core of the Earth mostly iron or stuff like that, iron's a pretty dense atom. I mean, it tends to form mostly very complex oxides and very complex elements with other metal atoms. Plus, iron is not something that's extremely soluble. Plus, when it does form solids, when it does form these intricate networks, the melting point of iron is several thousand degrees Celsius. And the boiling point for it is several hundred degrees Celsius, if memory serves. So
I think steel melts at 3,000 Fahrenheit or something. I forget.
Well,
could be.
It depends on what this is in the steel. But
right.
Iron's a pure thing. We can say what that is.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. Sorry.
Right. But so the point is, I mean, when during the phase of early bombardment of the Earth, when the Earth is forming, part of that is going to be all sorts of essentially cellular dirt being accreted by gravity, and meteorites or star stuff that has a lot of iron in it is going to fuse. And it's going to be very dense, even during the process of the Hadean period, or the period where the core is forming, because again, it's not overly soluble, and it's not like you can separate it very easily. It takes hundreds of thousands of degrees Celsius for it to come anywhere near close.
Okay. Well, I would say, yeah, it makes sense if nothing heavier than iron is around when the main part of the Earth is forming, but then to get these heavier elements just on the surface that didn't sink in while the Earth was molten would suggest that they would have had to come later. But the kind of event you would need to create those elements to come so much later seems like those kind of events would be very problematic for the Earth being able to be, exist.
Well, not
necessarily. All at once, it would have sunk into the core. These heavier elements.
So what I would have to say to that is, so let me just say this. Speaking from a chemistry perspective, and I think all chemistry is complex, but metals especially are very versatile in terms of their complexity. You move one row over on the periodic table, and the reactivity of one metal to another changes quite drastically. And there's various reasons.
Miraculous how the table fits together.
It's a lot of mathematics and quantum stuff, but yeah, sure. But the point is, ultimately, that whatever processes are present during early bombardment and during this phase where effectively the Earth has no atmosphere, quote unquote, is going to influence metals and the way those metals react and become soluble if they can be soluble at all, right? And over time, in addition to various geochemical processes, you're going to get some chemical species that are more abundant than others.
Yeah, but these heavy elements would presumably only be able to be formed in a supernova or something larger even. Or
Well,
more.
sure. I mean, remember, for instance, right, that according to what geophysicists say and what geologists say, right, the Earth formed about 4.85 billion years ago, something along that lines, and the universe is 13.8, 13.9 billion years old. So you have an 8 billion year time span for that to occur. So there's a lot of time in terms of, very dense stellar objects to have formed and to undergo processes that can form these heavy elements.
No, absolutely. I'm just thinking like you'd think like all the material would be kind of like a mix, more of a mix is all I'm saying. Like otherwise you have to like posit some sort of like event that's further out that brings these heavier elements later in far enough away that they don't destroy the Earth as it is in its primordial form or whatever. But it's all speculation to a degree. It's just like, can you come up with processes that can explain it? I accept that you can. Some of them just more, hard to imagine than others, of course, but it's possible.
Is it hard to imagine that when fusion occurs, right, that the prediction you make is that you have a heavier abundance of lighter elements and a lower abundance of heavier elements? And that makes sense given what we know about fusion and the way fusion has to occur for certain elements to form other elements. And the fact that certain elements that, like you mentioned, right, some of them take place using the RNS process, which are specific to certain stars and certain radiation. But other things like gold, for instance, tends to only form in the presence of something like a black hole merger or something very similar in magnitude to the energy levels that occur at that point. But
yeah, that's
in either scenario, though, like how those things form, I mean, it's not unreasonable that overall you don't have, as much gold as you do, as say like hydrogen or
sure,
phosphorus or whatever. But also an interesting prediction you make too, and this is because so when stars normally are producing things like helium and stuff like that, what they start with is hydrogen. Hydrogen is an element that has one proton. Helium has two. But so there's actually an interesting preponderance for when stars continue to fuse that elements of the periodic table that have an even number will tend to be so elements on the periodic table which have an even number tend to be in higher abundance than those that have an odd number, statistically speaking. And in fact, that's true.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Is that because of like some stability of electrons, or I mean, what would cause that?
I think it has to do with the fact that when you have, I think it has to do with the density of the atoms, and I think it also has to do with the way that the way that fusion occurs between atoms. Like it requires sometimes it requires a specific photon to be emitted, or a neutrino here or there to be emitted. And sometimes it's easier for that to occur with an even number than an odd number. It's really I'm not really qualified to speak on it, but that's what I've
That's okay.
been told. There's probably explanations that are better.
It was an interesting intuitive guess. So I asked you guys both to say what would change your position. It led to a very nice conversation. I never got Jamie's answer.
Which question?
What would change your position?
Oh, some sort of defeating, undeniable evidence, I guess. So, an example.
For what specifically, though? I mean,
probably for me, like honestly, I think some evidence that Scripture was came about in a certain particular way that was. I'm not sure because, like, I admit that it's really about Scripture for me. So if you
Well,
could
then-
show that it was contrived or controlled or distorted in
Wait,
some way that
You,
it
wait,
doesn't
you
seem
just
to be
gave the
complete.
answer.
Yeah.
You said it was based in scripture.
Yeah, you'd have to show me that a reason to not accept scripture, essentially, or to think it was more less trustable. What's the word? I can't even think. So I don't have a good answer, in other words, but I mean, it is about scripture for me. So if you could show that scripture was contrived in some particular way that to make me reject the way I understand it's the way it came down to us.
I have a question for you, Jamie.
Sure.
What Christian Middle Earth? What does that mean?
It's kind of an inside joke or whatever with a scholar I like. He calls it's Michael Heiser. He calls he gave us a talk, and he was mentioning certain people in the Christian community that like aren't scholars, but they're really interested in the Bible, sort of thing. And so he calls them, it's kind of Christian Middle Earth, he said. So I thought it's kind of an inside joke thing with some friends.
I gotcha. Okay. One of my favorite verses is the can you hear me?
Yeah, I
No,
can
we
hear
hear you
you.
fine. Keep going, man.
Okay, sorry. I thought I hit the button off. Anyways, Genesis, like I the hardest thing for me to get through is Genesis in the Bible because it's like I can never get past it. But if you take Genesis 6 literally, when it says the giants in the King James Version was in the earth, and we know that the giants survived the flood in the earth, do you believe that there were giants living in the earth back then?
So I'm undecided on how to interpret Genesis 6, although I lean towards this idea that angelic beings, spiritual beings, took on flesh of some kind and then mates with people, and then makes people, larger
No, I'm
subhuman.
not talking about that yet.
Okay. Do I think giants really existed? Is that what you're asking, or?
Well, what it says that giants were in the earth before and
then
after.
also after. Okay, yeah. So I kind
But
of
listen to my point. Let me make my point real quick. It says giants were in the earth, and people can pass that off, right? But then in the next line, it says when men and women began to multiply, where? On the face of
surface
the earth,
right.
or the face. Is that all right?
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Same thing.
yeah, I would suspect it means the same thing.
Why do you think the distinction between the two?
Oh,
Giants were in the earth when man began to multiply on the face of the earth.
I think it's just a literary decision. Like, so I would say,
So you get to kind of pick and choose what your literal interpretations are.
no, sometimes things
So if it doesn't fit like quite your narrative, you get to say, well, it doesn't necessarily mean in the earth.
No.
Especially when it says in the next line, when somebody else was doing something else on the face of the earth.
Could I show you something real quick?
You
Right
can.
there on the,
Yeah, let's see what
right
it says
there
in
on
the
the
Hebrew.
screen. There is no word in.
No.
It's not
Right,
there.
guessed. That's what I guessed.
Okay, let me show you.
Absolutely. That's why I said I was coming from the KJV version.
No, there
That's
is
why-
no word. Well,
No.
yeah, it appears in the King James. So does the word the.
Right,
But-
but you have the KJV YEC onlys, which is my point.
Okay, well, they're not going to be able to say that in the Hebrew there is the words in or the. Those are assumed completely, and the actual word right there is eretz, which just means firm, like something that's not a liquid or a gas.
So
Yeah.
meaning like in the earth?
Well, it doesn't say in the earth.
earth-
It just says
The earth
just
would
says
be
earth.
firm.
it just means firm earth. It doesn't.
It was
mean
a
anything else
translation
besides that.
decision by the
Right.
English translator.
Yeah.
So why the distinction, do you think, between why do you think the writer would go to the point of saying on the face of the earth?
I don't know. I'm going to go look at it for you.
I would
When
guess.
you read the KJV, there's a huge distinction.
So I would look to different translations and then compare them and then try to look at the original language. But I would say in their thinking, it's probably making somewhat, could be that it's making somewhat of a distinction about, because God tells them to spread out right on the earth after the flood. And then before that, it's just describing like more loosely on, what's going on earth before, and then a distinction of afterwards as man spreading around. But I mean, it's just like a literary decision, like you can do word for word, which doesn't work very well from Hebrew, or you.
All right. Well, my point is that if you're not a King James version onlyist, then it's not going to work. I get that. That's my point. That's why I asked if you were KJV, because there are those that do that, but then they don't want to take it literally when they tell you that it's the best form of the Bible to read. But I do want to see.
Take that position. I try to talk them out of it.
Well, I think it's a horrible position to take, and that's one of the reasons I stand on that. Is if you're going to take that position and stand there, then I'm going to hold you to it literally. But I would love to know what the difference between giants and Nephilim were, because I think giants and Nephilim were different if you read.
Well, yeah, the Nephilim could be the fallen angels, and then the giants are the offspring.
I think it's the opposite way around. The giants were here before.
Well, yeah. Well, it says that they were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. So I've always tended.
So the Nephilim would have been the offspring from the Son of Man that came down, and then the hybrids.
And the giants are just like the way I was kind of always.
You don't know who the giants are. It just says they were before and they were after.
Some people just think that means large animals. Like dinosaurs or larger.
Well, I guess you'd have to get a good hermeneutics in the Bible, right, and figure out what giants mean. Otherwise, I guess you could interpret anything to mean anything.
It appears to me there's giant clans that you see after the flood in the Old Testament, like the Rephaim and, the Zuzuim and all that stuff. So, in Goliath, right? But I always kind of...
You don't want to go there with me on Goliath.
Okay. I always just considered them genetic remnants of genetic people that were larger, because I suspect that was the case in the original genetically created person was larger, and then you have just some remnants of that, and then they were mighty men because they were capable, just like like.
Well, what makes them renowned?
Well, their exploits.
All right, so just because of their size, they were
one you wanted, taking things by force and whatever. I don't know. I mean, potentially anyway.
Can I, quick side note, Richard, you and I talked about Goliath at one point, and I sent you to a TED Talk that a guy had. Did you ever look at that?
Yes, I'm sure I did.
About how it talks about him looking at two sticks, but his vision isn't right because of the gigantism or giganticism. And then what else?
Okay, those things
about?
Are all true in people, and everything that he said makes sense if you're trying to justify it to history. And it might be a good justification of how this little dude wins, and that's fine. But that's not what the story is at all about. So it's kind of irrelevant to me.
Well, the problem is that you have such a different take on almost every version, every story, every word, that it's difficult to understand coming from what norm Christianity is, so to speak.
That's true.
So it's a completely different take. I remember when we met Needham the first time, I didn't know how to conversate with you because nothing was like what I had talked about or what I had known through Christianity. And I found myself at a loss and not prepared at all.
Yeah, imagine being me. It was really weird for me if it was weird for you.
Well, I was feeling like shit that day, but I still came on. But then I'm like, dude, I am totally not prepared. I'm prepared for Christian answers, not this.
Right.
Well,
I find it
I have
interesting,
a
like on the age of the earth and the flood and the destruction of the planet, and how did this happen, and how do you make that work out? I find it interesting, and I bothered to write them all down right here, and maybe I can make that a little bit larger. Actually, the word waters. Let's go with 200 and see what happens. The word waters here, from the book of Revelation, the whore that sitteth on many waters. Can I fit it all in there? Can't quite fit it at 200.
yeah, I can see most of it.
Well, I want you to be able to see all of it. Maybe you guys can read that. Maybe you cannot. But
It's 11:25. I'm way too stoned to read all that.
it's okay. What we have here is every occurrence of the word waters, from the very first time it's mentioned in the Bible all the way to, how far did I get before I just quit? Genesis 9:15. Okay. And the interesting thing to me is every single one of these occurrences, and skipping no occurrence of the word, it works to substitute the word waters with group of people or group of beings. It works absolutely 100% of the time without fail. And I'm not.
Are
I'm
there
not
any other
cherry-picking.
words you could? Are there any other words you could fit in there too that would work, or is that the
I
only
don't
word?
see how. Let me read you one. How else would you fit? And God said, "Let the large group of people under the heavens on the earth be gathered together unto one kind of place, and let the dry vacant of their kind of life, let the dry land appear." I don't know what else you could put there aside from large group of people. You could put liquid water there. People do. But I don't know of a third term you could use. And then the word waters doesn't, as H2O doesn't continuously work, whereas group of people does.
What if you used consciousness?
Well, it's talking
Would
about.
that be the large group of people? Would that be considered consciousness as one?
Well, now you're talking about an aspect of a large group of people. You know, like you couldn't put goats. That wouldn't work. They're not conscious enough. Because the waters start doing intelligent things.
Okay, the waters as in, I don't even know how to ask that. The waters as
So-
in something physical, something mental, something metaphysical.
Well, I think your question is, could you put consciousness in there? And I'm going to say at some level of awareness you could, but it'd have to be a pretty damned aware thing. But still, you know, when you get to that level of an awareness of an animal, you're talking about something sentient, something self-realizing, you know? So you're right back to a large group of beings.
I just told you how stoned I was, and now, yeah, this is way beyond me.
So my point is there is no occurrence all the way down to, I don't know, and the dove, which of course means Jesus, came into him the evening near the end of the day, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off from the whole of what is spoken. So Noah knew that the peoples were taken off the earth, abated. The large group of people weren't there anymore. But you can't put a whole lot of different things there where waters or people is right there. You can't just insert anything. It doesn't work.
This would be interesting to talk about sometime.
Oh, I'd love to. I'm not perfectly prepared, but I think I'm prepared enough to have a pretty decent conversation on it. So,
Oh, I'm not at the moment.
So and here's my argument: people never disagree with me until I start applying it to the Bible, and they'll agree right to the point. And it's not a bad comparative. If you picked up a letter that obviously was not written to you, it had someone else's name at the titling, at the heading, you start reading it, and they keep referring to this awesome experience that they really enjoyed, and several times through the letter, And the phrase they keep using is in the back seat of the 57 Chevy, right? Well, your imagination can go a lot of different places with that, depending on what they wrote. Like, remember that time in the backseat of the 57 Chevy when you and I had such an awesome time? I would love to do that again. You know, something like that. And they just keep talking about it in this positive manner. And then you get to the end of the letter, and no matter what your imagination might have done with that, it doesn't matter if they qualify it by saying, in the backseat of the 57 Chevy, I'll never forget the time you got me laughing so hard I wet my pants. Well, that would change the way you looked at it, and you'd have to backdate it. You know, you'd have to adjust what your brain thought, right? Go ahead.
Just being from Detroit, can I just say that I have never been in the back seat of a 57 Chevy with Richard? It was a 58.
Not yet. Don't never say never.
I said it was a 58, not a 57.
I wasn't even born till 68, bro. But anyway, I guess the car could have been 10 or more years old. Anyway, okay, so your brain would automatically update because there was definition given to the colloquial usage of a phrase, right? But Christians don't do that when they read a colloquial definition or a usage definition in the Bible for what it means by waters.
What if I could come up with
waters? It says it directly is per people, multitudes, nations, and tongues. It gives a definition.
What if I were to take my time and read that and read what you're studying if you gave it to me and stuff, and I were able to come up with another term or something that I could use in the same place?
That wouldn't matter because there's a definition in the letter.
Okay.
I mean, maybe you could come up with something else that fits, and that's I compliment you on your creativity. That's great, but it wouldn't matter.
That's why I'm asking you, because I don't completely understand everything that you're talking about right now. But if I could, and get something, and I were able to look over it and come up with something, would that change anything?
That isn't even what I'm talking about. Like if you write something and you're using, let's say you use the F-bomb. And I go, oh, offer of sex, offer of sex, offer of sex. And then by F-bomb, by the end of your letter, you make it very clear, you know, that, oh, and by the way, every time I've used the F-bomb, I meant get out of my damned life. Well, I can't write in whatever definition I want, even if it works, because you gave a definition for how you're using it.
At the end?
Sure, or at any point. It wouldn't matter where it was located.
I just don't see how that works.
Okay.
I couldn't say something to somebody through conversations,
sure,
and tell them one thing, keep telling them one thing, keep telling them one thing, and then 2 years later, still in conversation, oh, what I meant means something different at the end.
Yeah, we do.
What about the people that lived in between that time that interpreted it differently, that never saw the end or knew what the end meant?
Well, that would be a problem, and I would like to think the communicator would do it at an appropriate time, not when it's like too late or something.
What do you mean by that, communicator?
The author of the piece of literature would have to do it at such a time that, you know, that it's not like abusive or neglective or something like that. Like if you knew someone was leaving and you weren't going to see him again, you'd go ahead and say, oh, by this, I meant, you know, by the way, when I said this several times, I meant, you know, a thing.
But aren't we talking about what's written in the Bible that's been written over a long time, that these things could have been used over and over, and certain people read them this way but have died before the next ones that have been written that actually said, oh, no, this didn't mean that?
No, oh, absolutely. Of course, I hold that the intended reader is not the dude up the street that goes to a church. I don't think he's
not back in the day. No, it would have all been passed down. So all they would have heard is from somebody who maybe had heard from somebody who had read it.
Even right now, I think it doesn't make sense to say your Christian is the intended reader of the Bible, even if there was singular authorship by God. That wouldn't make sense. Like, for instance, if I ask the question, do Christians die? Well, that's obvious, right? So they definitely do something worse than twist their ankle by smashing their ankle against a rock, right? That worse stuff happens. But Psalm 139 promises that won't even happen. They won't even twist an ankle. Well, that can't be for the dude who's like just has the Bible by chance and is reading it. It's just not true.
All right.
So I think if there's a set of instructions, then it's for whoever can do it. That makes sense, right? And then the only one that does it in the story is the hero of the story, or Jesus. Then it's only
meant for a specific few?
It's only meant for Jesus, not even a few, one. It doesn't make sense to write it to a second person. It doesn't even make any sense.
Okay.
I mean,
We're gonna have to talk off. We're gonna have to talk sometime.
Yeah, I'd love to. It's just like if I wrote a set of instructions for someone who couldn't do it, I'm an idiot. You know what I'm saying?
Why would you do that?
I would never do that. But Christians somehow think that their God did. Because they'll say, I can't do it, even though I try a lot. I can't do it. They'll admit that, right? And then they say, I'm the intended reader. It can't be both. That doesn't make any sense.
I gotcha.
So that's what I think.
So let's talk more sometime.
Love to, man. You're a accommodating, open, intelligent person. Of course, I would talk to you anytime.
Thanks, man.
Well, I'm about tired anyway, and I need a cigarette. Immutable, you want to wrap
man.
up any last thoughts? Nope, already fell asleep.
Here you go. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Immutable.
Whoops.
Thanks a lot,
okay,
Maynard.
my bad. Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks for having me on. I'll see you guys later.
Blast.
Adios, amigos.
Adios. By the way, that means go with God, just in case you didn't know you were saying that. All right, guys. Until next time, peace and respect to you all. Thanks for dropping by, everybody in the side chat. Beck, Marty, Cryptomaria, Mac. There was some other names that I don't see very often that don't work easily from my memory. And, of course, Guitar Dog. And everyone else who came in to make this happen. Maynard Saves, Immutable, Midnight Sparkle. Thank you all very much. Till next time, guys, I want you all to know that I truly do look forward to the day that we're all great friends. Later.